This is a map of the world's oceans, today crisscrossed by invisible highways of ships and trade routes that connect every continent. These vast arteries of global commerce are so vital that the modern world could not exist without them. Yet, just over 5 centuries ago, none of these routes existed. The oceans were empty, uncharted, and terrifyingly unknown. The great web of maritime trade that sustains our civilization owes much of its origin to a small European nation perched on the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal. Barely the size of a modern province, it rose from obscurity to dominate the seas, connecting continents and reshaping the global order. But how did a small kingdom, hemmed between Spain and the Atlantic, rise to command an empire that would span from Brazil to India, from Africa to the Far East?
History is not just the past. It is the greatest story ever told. From the rise of mighty empires to their fiery collapse, history has shaped the world in ways that continue to amaze us. From warriors who carved kingdoms to revolutions that changed the course of civilization, every moment holds a story worth remembering. From ancient wonders like the Great Wall and Da Vinci's timeless sketches, to humanity reaching for the stars with the Apollo 11 mission, the journey of mankind is nothing short of extraordinary. This channel brings history to life through fast-paced stories, cinematic storytelling, and epic journeys across time. We explore battles, betrayals, inventions, and legends, the defining moments that shaped who we are today. If you have ever wanted to see history as if you were truly there, you have found the right place. Step into the past, relive the greatest stories ever lived, and join our journey through time. Subscribe now.
This is the story of courage, ambition, and unrelenting exploration, the entire history of the Portuguese Empire. To understand Portugal's journey to empire, we must go back to its roots. The Kingdom of Portugal emerged during the Middle Ages, carved out of centuries of warfare between Christian and Muslim powers on the Iberian Peninsula, a struggle known as the Reconquista. By the mid-12th century, Portugal had gained recognition as a sovereign kingdom under King Alfonso Henriques. Over the next century, it pushed steadily southward, driving out the Muslim Moors who had ruled much of the region since the 8th century. By 1249, the Portuguese had captured the last Moorish stronghold of the Algarve, securing their borders almost exactly as they stand today. With their homeland now stable and no more land to claim on the Iberian Peninsula, the Portuguese turned their gaze outward, to the sea. The Atlantic lay before them like a vast, untested frontier. Unlike their neighbors in Castile, whose ambitions were largely continental, the Portuguese saw their destiny in the waves. In 1415, the kingdom took its first major step towards empire by launching an expedition to Ceuta, a wealthy Muslim port city on the North African coast. The city fell quickly to Portuguese arms, marking not only the first overseas conquest of Portugal, but also the symbolic beginning of the Portuguese Empire. Many saw the attack on Ceuta as simply another crusade against Islam, a continuation of the Reconquista. But its true importance lay in something far greater. Ceuta opened the gateway to Africa and the Atlantic. From its harbors, Portuguese ships could now explore southward, beyond the limits of the known world. At the heart of these early voyages stood one man, Prince Henry the Navigator. Though he rarely sailed himself, Henry's vision and curiosity turned Portugal into the laboratory of European exploration. He was determined to discover how far the Muslim lands in Africa extended and whether it was possible to reach the riches of Asia, especially the lucrative spice markets, by sailing east around the continent. Under his patronage, the Portuguese established a navigation school at Sagres, trained mapmakers, and improved their ships, developing the caravel, a revolutionary vessel capable of sailing against the wind and surviving long voyages. With these innovations, Portuguese explorers began to push south along the unfamiliar coastlines of Africa, marking each new discovery on their charts. In 1419, they discovered the lush volcanic island of Madeira, and a few years later in 1427, they came upon the distant Azores, far out in the Atlantic. These islands became Portugal's first overseas possessions, stepping stones into the wider ocean. But progress was slow and perilous. The early mariners faced uncharted waters, strong currents, and fierce winds. For years, ships dared not pass Cape Bojador, a feared promontory on the western Sahara coast where many believed the sea boiled and ships would burn under the sun. That myth was shattered in 1434 when Gil Illanes, one of Henry's captains, successfully sailed beyond the Cape and returned home safely. It was a small step geographically, but a monumental leap psychologically. The world had suddenly grown larger, and Portugal had become its pioneer. From then on, Portuguese ships pressed ever farther south, reaching new lands and new peoples. They returned with gold, ivory, pepper, and tragically, the first enslaved Africans, the beginnings of a trade that would stain history for centuries to come. Lisbon's markets filled with exotic goods, and the profits from these ventures transformed the small kingdom into a rising power. But this was only the beginning. The ultimate prize still lay thousands of miles away, the fabled Indies, where spices worth their weight in gold awaited discovery. The question was simple, but world-changing. Could a ship sail around Africa and reach Asia by sea? That question would soon be answered. By the late 15th century, Portugal had transformed from a provincial kingdom into a nation of explorers. The unknown edges of maps were no longer barriers, they were invitations. Each voyage returned with new knowledge, new riches, and new ambitions. The kingdom's horizons expanded with every expedition. The greatest challenge was still before them, rounding the southern tip of Africa, a route believed to lead into the fabled Indian Ocean. In 1488, that challenge was finally met. A Portuguese navigator named Bartolomeu Dias set sail from Lisbon with a small fleet braving storms and treacherous seas. For months, he and his crew battled the winds of the South Atlantic, sailing farther south than any European had ever dared. Then, after being driven far off course by violent gales, Diaz turned north and found himself sailing along Africa's eastern coast. He had done it. He had rounded the continent. When he returned home, he named the point of passage the Cape of Good Hope, for it proved that a sea route to Asia truly existed. Portugal rejoiced at the news, but before they could act, the world changed once more. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, crossed the Atlantic and stumbled upon an entirely new world, the Americas. His voyage would spark rivalry between Spain and Portugal, two neighbors now competing to divide the world itself. To prevent conflict, the two powers turned to diplomacy. In 1494, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, an agreement sanctioned by the Pope that drew a vertical line across the globe. Lands to the west of that line would belong to Spain, lands to the east to Portugal. Unknowingly, this invisible boundary gave Portugal claim over a vast, unknown territory that would later become Brazil. With the dispute settled, Portugal could now pursue its long-awaited mission to reach Asia by sea. In 1497, Vasco da Gama embarked from Lisbon with 4 ships and a crew of 170 men. The journey was perilous and grueling. They endured storms, disease, and mutiny as they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and crossed the Indian Ocean. After nearly 10 months at sea, they sighted the coast of India. On May 20th, 1498, da Gama anchored off the port city of Calicut, on the Malabar coast. It was the moment that changed history. Europe had finally reached Asia by sea. The local ruler, the Zanmarin of Calicut, welcomed da Gama's arrival, but the trade the Portuguese offered, simple cloth, beads, and trinkets, held little value compared to India's rich spices and precious stones. Still, the voyage proved that direct maritime trade with Asia was possible. When da Gama returned to Lisbon 2 years later, he was hailed as a hero. Though few of his men survived, he had opened a new path that would reshape the world economy. The next expedition, led by Pedro Alvarez Cabral in 1500, was intended to follow da Gama's route, but fate had other plans. Pushed westward by Atlantic winds, Cabral's fleet sighted a vast coastline. the shores of what would soon be known as Brazil. It was an unintentional discovery, but one that would prove vital for Portugal's future. After claiming the new land for the Portuguese crown, Cabral continued his voyage to India. There, his ships encountered fierce resistance from local traders, many of whom resented the arrival of foreign merchants disrupting their ancient networks. Conflict soon followed, and Portuguese cannons made their presence known. Over the next decade, Portuguese fleets returned again and again, this time armed and ready to assert control. Under the leadership of Alfonso de Albuquerque, a brilliant naval commander, Portugal began to establish fortified trading posts along Africa, Arabia, and India's coasts. In 1010, Albuquerque captured the city of Goa, turning it into the capital of Portuguese India. From there, he pushed farther east, seizing Malacca in 1511, the gateway to the rich spice islands of Southeast Asia. For the first time in history, a European power controlled the maritime routes connecting the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Lisbon became the beating heart of global trade. Ships known as carracks carried spices, silks, and precious metals from Asia, while gold and slaves came from Africa and sugar flowed from Brazil. The wealth of the world poured into Portugal's ports, transforming the once poor kingdom into one of the richest nations in Europe. But with great wealth came great rivalry. Other European powers watched in envy as Portugal's empire grew across the seas. The Dutch, the English, and the French all began to prepare their own voyages, seeking a share of the riches that the Portuguese had claimed.
Still, in the early 1500s, the empire stood unrivaled. The Crimson Cross of Portugal flew from fortresses across continents, from the shores of Mozambique to the islands of Indonesia, from the ports of India to the coast of China. The Portuguese Empire had truly become a world-spanning realm born from the sea. Yet, even as trade flourished, darker forces took root. The empire's prosperity increasingly depended on forced labor and the growing transatlantic slave trade. Human lives were now measured in profit, their suffering hidden beneath the glitter of empire. As the 16th century advanced, Portugal's empire would continue to expand, but it would also face the limits of power, the burdens of greed, and the challenges of new rivals rising on the horizon. By the mid-1500s, Portugal stood at the height of its power. From Lisbon's grand harbor, fleets set sail to every corner of the known world, laden with gold, spices, ivory, and silk. The royal treasury overflowed, cathedrals rose higher than ever before, and the Portuguese flag fluttered over ports thousands of miles apart. But maintaining such a vast empire came at an immense cost. Every victory demanded soldiers, ships, and silver, far more than a small European kingdom could easily provide. And while Lisbon glittered with the wealth of the East, the strength of the empire rested on fragile foundations. In Asia, the Portuguese ruled not by numbers, but by fortress and fear. In cities like Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz, they built stone bastions that dominated the seas. Cannons, not treaties, enforced their will. They called their network of ports the Estado da India, the State of India, and it became the backbone of Portugal's Asian power. But trade and faith walked hand in hand. Alongside merchants and sailors came missionaries, determined to spread Christianity across the lands they had conquered. The most famous among them was Francis Xavier, a Jesuit priest who traveled through India, Japan, and even reached the fringes of China. To many, he symbolized the spiritual mission of Portugal's empire, to bring salvation as well as civilization. Yet the reality was far more complex. Local peoples often resisted conversion, and Portuguese rule was harsh. In Africa and Brazil, enslaved men and women were shipped across the Atlantic to labor in plantations. Sugar, white gold as it was called, became one of Portugal's most profitable exports, but its sweetness was built on unimaginable suffering. Still, the empire expanded. In 1543, Portuguese traders became the first Europeans to reach Japan, introducing firearms and foreign goods that would soon alter Japanese warfare. They established contact with Macau in China, which became their most valuable Asian port after Goa, a gateway for trade between East and West. For nearly a century, Portugal's empire seemed unstoppable. But as time passed, cracks began to form. Rivals began to rise. The Dutch and English entered the Indian Ocean, armed with faster ships and organized under powerful trading companies, the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company. Unlike Portugal, these nations were not limited by royal bureaucracy. They were private enterprises, driven purely by profit and efficiency. The Portuguese, scattered across their far-flung outposts, could not match their growing power. One by one, their strongholds came under attack. The Dutch seized Malacca, Ceylon, and parts of Brazil. The English challenged Portuguese trade in India. Even Spain, Portugal's neighbor and rival, began to overshadow it in wealth and influence. Then, in 1580, disaster struck at home. King Sebastian I of Portugal had perished in a reckless crusade against the Moors in Morocco, leaving no heir. His death plunged the kingdom into crisis. After years of political chaos, the Spanish king, Philip II, claimed the Portuguese crown, uniting the two Iberian empires under one rule. For 60 years, Portugal ceased to exist as an independent kingdom, its empire now part of Spain's vast dominion. During this Iberian Union, 1580 to 1440, Portuguese colonies were neglected and targeted by Spain's enemies. Dutch and English fleets seized many Portuguese possessions, taking advantage of the empire's weakened defenses. The once proud maritime nation had lost control of its destiny.
Much of Asia was lost to the Dutch, and Portugal's influence in the Indian Ocean had faded. Only fragments remained: Goa, Macau, Timor, and a scattering of African ports. To survive, the Portuguese turned westward, toward their great land in the Americas, Brazil. It was there, in the vast jungles and fertile coasts of South America, that Portugal would find both revival and redemption. Brazil became the beating heart of the empire, rich in sugar, gold, and later coffee. Its plantations grew vast, worked by millions of enslaved Africans. By the 18th century, gold from Brazil filled Lisbon's coffers and funded palaces, churches, and grand monuments. The wealth of the New World temporarily restored Portugal's glory, even as it deepened the scars of colonial exploitation. But history has a way of turning fortunes into burdens. The very empire that had once lifted Portugal to greatness would, in time, become the source of its decline. By the dawn of the 19th century, revolutions and new powers were reshaping the world. Spain's colonies in the Americas were rising in rebellion, and soon Portugal's most valuable possession, Brazil, would seek its own path to freedom. By the early 1800s, the winds of change were sweeping across the Atlantic. Revolutions in America and Europe were rewriting the balance of power, and Portugal, once the master of the seas, now stood at a crossroads between past glory and a fading world. In 1807, the thunder of war reached its shores. Napoleon Bonaparte, in his conquest of Europe, ordered French troops to invade Portugal after the kingdom refused to join his blockade against Britain. As enemy forces approached Lisbon, the Portuguese royal family made a desperate choice. They fled. In a stunning and unprecedented act, the entire Portuguese court, nobles, ministers, servants, and soldiers, sailed across the ocean to Brazil, escorted by the British Navy. For the first time in history, a European empire had shifted its capital to the New World. In Rio de Janeiro, King João VI established his royal court, transforming the colonial city into the new center of Portuguese power. Palaces rose, streets were paved, and Brazil became not just a colony, but the heart of the Portuguese Empire. When Napoleon's armies were finally defeated, João faced a dilemma: return to Portugal or remain in the land that had made him safe and wealthy. He hesitated, but in 1821, pressed by revolution at home, he sailed back to Lisbon, leaving behind his son, Dom Pedro, as regent of Brazil. The following year, history turned once again. Inspired by the independence movements sweeping Latin America, Brazilians demanded freedom from European rule, and in 1822, Dom Pedro declared Brazil's independence, becoming Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. It was a bloodless revolution. Father and son parted as monarchs of two separate nations. For Portugal, it was both a relief and a heartbreak. The jewel of its empire was gone. After the loss of Brazil, Portugal's global power shrank to scattered colonies, outposts in Africa, Asia, and the Atlantic islands. But these remnants, though small, still carried the weight of centuries. The empire endured, even as the world around it changed. During the 19th century, Europe's age of imperialism reignited, and Portugal sought to hold its ground among the great colonial powers. In Africa, it expanded its control over Angola and Mozambique, claiming vast territories deep inland. But these ambitions soon led to conflict. In 1890, Britain, the very ally that had once protected Portugal, issued an ultimatum, demanding the Portuguese abandon their plan to link their African colonies across the continent. The humiliation shocked Lisbon, sparking outrage and despair. To many, it was the final proof that Portugal's empire no longer commanded respect or power. At home, political instability deepened. The monarchy struggled to modernize, and discontent grew among soldiers and workers. In 1910, a revolution erupted in Lisbon, ending centuries of royal rule and proclaiming the Portuguese Republic. Yet even the new republic clung to the remnants of empire. In the mid-20th century, while other European nations began granting independence to their colonies, Portugal, under the authoritarian rule of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, refused to let go. Salazar called his colonies overseas provinces, insisting they were part of one united Portugal. But the world no longer accepted such illusions. Across Africa and Asia, nationalist movements rose in defiance. In Goa, India reclaimed its territory from Portuguese control in 1961. In Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, long and brutal wars for independence erupted during the 1960s and 70s. Thousands of Portuguese soldiers were sent to fight in distant jungles and savannas, often against people who had once called them neighbors.
The wars dragged on for over a decade, draining Portugal's economy and morale. By 1974, the strain became unbearable. That year, Portuguese soldiers, weary of endless colonial wars, rose up in a peaceful coup known as the Carnation Revolution. The dictatorship collapsed overnight. In the aftermath, the new democratic government moved quickly to end the fighting and grant independence to all remaining colonies. One by one, the empire's final possessions slipped away. In 1975, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and São Tomé and Príncipe became independent nations. In 1999, Macau, the last Asian colony, was peacefully returned to China. And with that, after more than 6 centuries, the Portuguese Empire, the first global empire in history, came to an end. Today, the Portuguese Empire exists only in memory, in the ruins of old forts, in the echoes of Catholic cathedrals on tropical coasts, and in the words of millions who still speak Portuguese across the world. From Brazil to Mozambique, from Angola to East Timor, the language of Portugal became one of the most spoken tongues on earth, a living legacy of sailors who once set out from a small Atlantic kingdom in search of the unknown. Portugal's empire was built on courage and cruelty, faith and greed, discovery and domination. It shaped the modern world for better and for worse. It connected continents, cultures, and peoples in ways that could never be undone. It brought knowledge, trade, and innovation, but also conquest, slavery, and suffering. The story of Portugal's empire is ultimately the story of human ambition itself. How far we are willing to go to reach the horizon and what we lose when we finally get there.